All good times must come to an end. Decreased consumer demand, you can only buy so many cars and radios, and mounting consumer debt, coupled with overconfidence in buying stocks, meant stock was highly overvalued. On what would become known as Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, the stock market crashed, triggering the worst economic downturn in American history. The Great Depression, which marked the end of the overconsumptive, free-wheeling roaring 20s. Millions of stock shares ended up being worthless, and consumer confidence vanished. The resulting decrease in consumer spending caused factories to slow production, laying off workers. By 1930, 4 million Americans looking for work could not find it, and by 1931, that number was 6 million. Many Americans with debt were unable to pay it off and had their homes foreclosed upon. Homelessness became more common. The construction of the Empire State Building, which would be the first building in the world to have more than 100 floors, had broken ground only a few weeks before the stock market crash. Many tall buildings were being planned and constructed during the late 1920s, a facet of the optimism inherent to the period. This race into the sky included 5 other proposed buildings, but only the Empire State Building would make it due to the crash of 1929. The project was completed in just 1 year and 45 days, a record-setting speed. But because of the Great Depression, there was virtually no demand for office space, and the building sat mostly empty until the 1940s. In addition to the economic woes, in 1930 severe drought swept from Texas to Nebraska, bringing with it high winds and dust that killed people, livestock, and crops. This became known as the Dust Bowl, and it inspired many more people to migrate from the plains to the cities in search of work. From 1930 to 1933, the economic crisis only continued to get worse as thousands of banks were forced to close. President Herbert Hoover tried supporting the failing banks, but Hoover was a Republican who believed the government should not directly intervene in the economy or provide economic relief. In 1932, with close to 15 million people unemployed nationwide, voters overwhelmingly elected Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt, who took immediate action. During his first 100 days in office, the Roosevelt administration passed legislation to reform and reopen banks, stabilize industrial and agricultural production, and create jobs. The unemployment rate in 1935 was at a staggering 20%. So, via executive order, Roosevelt created a permanent jobs program called the Works Progress Administration. From 1935 to 1943, the WPA employed 8.5 million people, building schools, hospitals, roads, and other public works, as well as in arts projects, employing tens of thousands of actors, musicians, writers, and other artists. At its height in late 1938, more than 3.3 million Americans worked for the WPA. They built more than 4,000 new school buildings, erected 130 new hospitals, laid roughly 9,000 miles of storm drains and sewer lines, built 29,000 new bridges, constructed 150 new airfields, paved or repaired 280,000 miles of road, and planted 24 million trees to alleviate loss of topsoil during the Dust Bowl. Among the most famous projects built by the WPA are the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, New York City's Lincoln Tunnel, the LaGuardia Airport in Queens, and the iconic red San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. New Deal funds were also used for the construction of Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. U.S. Presidents George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln into the side of the mountain were carved by a total of about 400 artists. Tools were forged by blacksmiths, and tramway operators shuttled people and equipment to and from the base of the remote mountain. The project cost nearly $1 million, about 85% of which was from federal funds. The WPA was criticized for the project's slowness and inefficiencies, but it was celebrated for the employment it offered millions of people suffering during the Depression. Other notable New Deal programs included the creation of the Social Security Administration to protect older Americans financially, the Agricultural Adjustment Act to help farmers get out of debt, and the U.S. Housing Authority was created to address homelessness. The National Labor Relations Act was passed to protect labor organizing in 1935, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 set maximum hours and minimum wages for most workers. But not everyone was a fan of Roosevelt's reforms, with conservative opponents calling them government overreach. After the elections of 1938, New Deal policies became more difficult to enact because the new Congress was less liberal and less supportive of spending. The election of these new conservative members of the Congress was largely due to a dip in public opinion towards the Roosevelt administration during the economic recession of 1937 to 1938. With Roosevelt claiming responsibility for the previous economic improvements, people blamed him for the backslide. Nevertheless, the New Deal's popularity helped the Democratic Party remain the majority party in national politics into the 1960s. When the Second World War kicked off in Europe in fall 1939, the vast majority of Americans were still in favor of isolation. President Roosevelt, however, realized the importance of ensuring that Britain and France had every chance of success in the conflict. When France fell completely in June 1940, Roosevelt began implementing a Lend-Lease program with the British, sending war material and humanitarian supplies on American ships. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese fleet at last appeared and struck at the American naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack did serious damage to the fleet, destroying 3 battleships and damaging several other vessels. However, the Japanese were unsuccessful in destroying the American aircraft carriers. The attack shocked and appalled Americans. Japan had hoped the attack would cripple the American Pacific Fleet and allow them to swiftly take control of the Pacific theater. Instead, the Americans recovered with nearly inhuman speed and in less than 6 months struck a devastating blow against the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway. The American victory at Midway opened the Pacific to the U.S. fleet and allowed for U.S. ground troops to be safely shuttled to Japanese-held islands. In Europe, following the general declaration of war on Japan after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, declared war on the United States, joining his Axis ally. The United States, now a part of the Allied powers, was eager to help Britain regain control of the European theater. The War Department began planning a series of military operations to retake North Africa and Europe from fascist control, whilst simultaneously planned for a prolonged invasion of the dozens of islands in the Pacific to aid Australia and the Philippines from Japan. The United States was again at war, and this time facing enemies on 2 separate fronts on a global scale. The entire country mobilized, with millions of men enlisting to serve, and the millions left on the home front adapting to produce war material and other goods to support the war effort. Sadly, the fear and xenophobia towards Asian Americans caused by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor led Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 9066, ordering the internment of any and all citizens who posed a national security threat to the country. With much of the west coast of the United States divided into military districts for the prosecution of an overseas war, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, more than 2/3 of them born in the United States, were removed from their homes and settled into camps further inland and away from U.S. military operations along the west coast. Roosevelt's administration, as well as the Army High Command, immediately realized the importance of liberating Europe as soon as possible. The early victory against the Japanese Navy at Midway gave the U.S. Armed Forces a chance to reassess their strategy in the Pacific while planning for operations in Europe. After some debate, North Africa was chosen as the first landing site for U.S. troops to begin the liberation of the Allies in Europe. In fall 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch to strike a quick and decisive blow against the Axis-controlled North African coast. The assault was a massive multinational operation involving the United States, the United Kingdom, India, Canada, the Netherlands, Free France, and Australian forces. Over the course of a week, the Allied powers fought for control of major ports along the African coast. and were successful in occupying much of Morocco and Algiers. Operation Torch was the first step in an Allied advance, which would gradually take control over all of North Africa and move on to Italy by the fall of 1943. In the Pacific, US forces embarked on what was known as an island hopping or leapfrogging campaign. Utilizing the strength and speed of the US Navy, the Americans were able to quickly deploy US Marines and Army forces on the hundreds of islands under Japanese control across the South Pacific. The strategy worked well, keeping the Japanese forces under constant threat of attack and slowly choking their ability to reinforce and supply important islands. The Japanese were often forced to take shelter and fight for every square inch of ground, without hope of reprieve or escape. Over the course of 2 years, beginning in the fall of 1942, the U.S. Armed Forces fought brutal campaigns at Guadalcanal, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, and many others. In Europe, with the fall of Italy, the US and the Allies turned their attention to liberating France from Nazi control. On the other side of the European continent, the Soviet Union had at long last repulsed the German invasion of their homeland, and were steadily pushing the Nazis back toward Germany. Seizing on the opportunity, American and British strategists planned for an audacious amphibious assault on the Normandy beaches in the north of France. Under the direction of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allied forces launched Operation Neptune, more popularly known as D-Day, on June 6, 1944. Like Operation Torch in North Africa, D-Day was a multinational assault and included most of the Allied powers, with significant contributions from American, British, Canadian, Australian, and French forces. Undoubtedly one of the most well-known moments of the Second World War, D-Day represented the pinnacle of Allied cooperation and marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Germany and the Axis powers. It did not take long for the German occupation of France to collapse under the weight of the Allied liberation following D-Day. By the winter of 1944, Allied forces had pushed the Nazi troops to the border of France and Germany and prepared for winter engagements through the Ardennes forest. As the Soviets continued their relentless assault in the east, Hitler diverted critical military assets west, hoping to take the Allies by surprise. In December 1944, German forces launched what would be their final offensive of the war through the Ardennes. The assault was initially successful, pushing Allied forces back. Fortunately, Allied air superiority slowed the Nazi advance and ground it to a halt. When the offensive finally ended, the Germans had successfully nearly encircled a large pocket of US troops and dug in for the winter.